For years, I believed my father was my guardian, the one person I could always rely on to shield me from life's hardships. Aren't fathers supposed to be that way? A protector, a mentor, someone who loves you without asking for anything in return? That's what I told myself every time I looked at him. But the reality, the truth, was far darker than I ever could have imagined. Over time, the man I trusted most became the one I dreaded waking up to see each morning. That shift didn't happen suddenly. It came in pieces, fragments of moments that, looking back, were all leading towards something I couldn't stop. I can still remember the day everything changed, the day I no longer felt safe in my own home. My world had already been shattered when my mom passed away. She was my foundation, the kind of person whose very presence lit up a room. Her absence felt like a void, swallowing everything I thought I knew. And just when I thought I couldn't break anymore, my dad found a way to make sure I did. I wish I could say I saw it coming, that there were signs or warnings, but there weren't. One moment, I was a grieving teenager holding on to my father as the only family I had left. The next, I had become something unrecognizable, even to myself. This is my story, a story of betrayal, a story of survival, a story about finding my voice when everything around me tried to silence it. My name is Valerie Warner. Growing up, my life seemed ordinary, full of small joys, routine days, and a sense of comfort you don't realize is fleeting until it's gone. My mom, Claire, was the heart of our family. She had a way of remembering every little detail about you, what made you laugh, what brought you to tears, and your favorite breakfast on even the worst days. Her laugh could brighten the darkest room. For as long as I can remember, she was my sanctuary. My dad, Jack Abbott, was quieter. Not cold, but reserved, as if he carried some unseen burden. Still, I believed he loved us. Life wasn't perfect. No family is. But I thought we were lucky. We had Sunday movie nights, piling onto the couch and losing track of time. Mom always made popcorn, slightly burnt but somehow still delicious. Dad would sit beside her, his arm draped casually over her shoulders. It was a picture of normalcy. But in hindsight, that picture was far more fragile than I realized. Everything changed when my mom became ill. It wasn't one of those sudden illnesses you see on TV. It was slow, drawn out, and merciless. Watching her fade over months felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing there was no way to pull her back. I was only 16, but in many ways, I grew up overnight. I tried to stay strong, for her, for us. But when she passed, something inside me broke. The world felt colder, emptier, as if a light had gone out, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Dad changed too. At first I thought it was grief. Losing the person you built a life with can destroy anyone. He stopped going to work regularly, stayed home more, and spoke less and less. His hugs grew tighter, longer, as if he was clinging to the last piece of something he couldn't bear to lose. At the time, it seemed almost sweet, even comforting. I thought we were leaning on each other to survive the hardest days of our lives. But grief doesn't always bring people closer. Sometimes, it distorts them. As days turned into weeks, I began to notice cracks in the man I thought I knew. He wasn't just distant. He was different. His gaze lingered too long. His touches felt off. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things because everything else already felt so wrong. I wanted so badly to believe he was just trying to protect me, the way I'd always believed he would. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to the voice in my head telling me something was wrong. But at 16, grieving and alone, it was easier to silence that voice than face the truth it was trying to reveal. And so, I ignored it. It began on a quiet evening, just the two of us in the house. The silence felt heavier than ever, making every sound, every creak of the couch, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustling leaves outside, unbearably loud. We were sitting in the living room, a space that once felt warm and alive, but now seemed hollow and cold. The TV was on, but neither of us was watching it. It was just background noise, a distraction from the emptiness that hung between us. "You look so much like her," he said suddenly, his voice soft, almost tender. I turned to him, confused. People had always said I resembled my mom, her eyes, her smile. But I didn't know how to respond, so I didn't. I forced a small, awkward smile and turned back to the TV, hoping the moment would pass. But it didn't. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear. It was such a simple gesture, one that might have been innocent in another context, but it didn't feel innocent. His hand lingered, just a moment too long. My body went rigid, a knot forming in my stomach. Something was wrong. I wanted to move, to stand up, to say something, but I couldn't. It felt as though my mind and body were disconnected, leaving me paralyzed. "You're so beautiful," he said, his hand resting on my shoulder. The words hung heavily in the air, suffocating me. Before I could comprehend what was happening, his hand slid lower, brushing against my chest. Panic surged through me, but it was smothered by disbelief. This was my father, my dad. This couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. When his hand moved to my thigh, I finally snapped out of my daze. "Dad, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaky and barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed a finger to his lips to silence me and leaned in closer. The room felt like it was spinning. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might explode. I wanted to scream, to push him away, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if fear had locked every muscle in place. The next moments blurred together. I remember him pulling me to the floor, his weight pressing me down. I remember the sharp pain, the tears running down my face. But most of all, I remember the silence. Not from him. He muttered things I couldn't make out, but from me. I didn't scream. I didn't fight. I just lay there, frozen, with tears soaking the carpet beneath me. When it was over, he got up and walked away without saying a word, leaving me crumpled on the floor. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too shocked to move. My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Why didn't I stop it? That night, I locked myself in my room and cried until there were no tears left. But the worst part wasn't the pain or even the betrayal. It was the guilt. A quiet, insidious voice in my head kept whispering that it was my fault, that I must have done something to cause this, even though I didn't know what. After that night, I didn't leave my room for a week. I couldn't. The walls felt like the only thing keeping me safe from a world that suddenly felt foreign, dangerous, and suffocating. I skipped meals, ignored my dad's attempts to talk through the door, and buried myself under the covers, as though hiding could somehow erase what had happened. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the floor, hearing his voice, feeling his weight. I didn't know how to process it, so I didn't. I just let myself go numb. On the 5th day, I heard a knock on the door. It was him. "Valerie," he called, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Can we talk?" My chest tightened. I wanted to scream at him to leave, but I stayed silent, hoping he'd think I wasn't there. But he didn't go. "I know you're upset," he continued, "but we need to move past this. We're all we have now." His words hit me like a slap. Move past this? My stomach churned, but before anger could take over, doubt crept in. What if he was right? My mom was gone. It really was just the two of us. What if I was overreacting? What if I had done something to cause this? The questions twisted in my mind, digging the guilt deeper. Eventually, I let him in. I couldn't avoid him forever, and part of me craved answers, some explanation that might make this all make sense. He sat on the edge of my bed, his face etched with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Was it guilt? Sadness? Something else? "I'm sorry if I hurt you," he said, reaching for my hand. I instinctively pulled away, and for a moment, his expression darkened before softening again. "You're so much like your mom," he whispered. "Sometimes I forget. I just miss her so much." He used her memory as a shield, weaving her name into his words like a weapon. "I shouldn't have done what I did," he admitted. "But it's hard, being alone. You remind me of her so much. I don't know. Maybe I got confused. It won't happen again." But it did. Less than 2 weeks later. By then, he had started reframing everything, casting himself as the victim of his grief and loneliness. He stopped knocking and began coming into my room uninvited, sitting on the bed as though nothing had changed. He talked about everyday things, school, dinner plans, chores, as if life hadn't been turned upside down. But every time he looked at me, I felt it. That weight, that expectation, like he was waiting for me to make everything okay again. The second time hurt just as much, even if it wasn't as shocking. It was a Saturday night. We had just finished dinner, and I was clearing the table when he came up behind me, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Let's watch a movie," he said, his tone casual, even cheerful. But something about it made my skin crawl. I wanted to say no, to come up with an excuse and escape to my room, but the words caught in my throat. So I followed him to the living room, telling myself it was fine, that he wouldn't try anything, that I could leave if I felt uncomfortable. But then his hand found its way to my leg, and the cycle began again. His touches were slower this time, less hurried, as though he wanted to ease me into this horrifying new reality. When it was over, he looked at me with an expression that almost resembled affection. "I'll be more careful next time," he said. "I'll get protection, I promise." Careful. Like this was normal. Like this was something we just had to get used to. His words echoed in my mind, twisting my guilt and shame into something even darker. Maybe this was my fault. Maybe I had allowed this to happen. Maybe I owed it to him, to keep him from being alone, to give him what he said he needed. The thought made me sick, but it also made me stay silent. In the weeks that followed, I shut down completely. I stopped spending time with friends, avoided my teachers, and withdrew from anything that might prompt questions I wasn't ready to answer. I buried myself in books and schoolwork, anything to keep my mind distracted. But in the quiet moments, those long nights, those strained dinners, the times he looked at me just a second too long, the weight of it all crushed me. I thought about confiding in someone, anyone, my best friend, a counselor, or even a stranger on the street. But every time I got close, fear held me back. What if they didn't believe me? What if they thought it was my fault? What if it destroyed what little family I had left? The questions were endless, and the risks felt too great, so I stayed silent. I convinced myself this was the best way, that I could handle it, that I had no other choice. Weeks turned into months, and my dad's actions became less shocking, though they were no less painful. The incidents were sporadic, sometimes weeks apart, as though he was testing how much I could take without completely breaking. I started rationalizing it, telling myself that maybe grief had broken him in this way, that it wasn't as bad as it felt. After all, he always apologized afterward, his voice filled with guilt and promises to change. He swore he loved me, that I was the only reason he kept going. It was twisted, but in the absence of anyone else, I began to believe him. That belief, however, didn't erase the disgust I felt every time he touched me. I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run. But over time, those instincts dulled, replaced by a numb acceptance. I told myself this was easier, that resisting would only make things worse. On some dark level, a part of me clung to the attention. It wasn't love, far from it, but it was something. A connection. A distorted, awful kind of comfort that made the loneliness hurt a little less. Then, Lila Moss entered the picture. She was bubbly, full of life, with a laugh that could brighten any room. When my dad introduced her as his girlfriend, I felt a strange mix of relief and jealousy. Relief because I thought maybe this meant he would stop, that he would shift his focus to her and leave me alone. But jealousy bubbled up too, a shameful, sick feeling I didn't fully understand. Was I jealous of her? Of the fact that she could offer him something I couldn't? Or was I angry that he could pretend to be normal with her while I was drowning in the chaos he had created? For a few months, things were quiet. The nights when he would slip into my room stopped, and I began to feel like I could breathe again. I threw myself into school, trying to piece together a semblance of a life. But that fragile piece shattered one night when I came home early from a study group. Walking into the living room, I saw Lila sitting far too close to my dad on the couch, her hand resting on his thigh. "You're so beautiful," she said, her voice sweet and syrupy. My stomach churned. My dad didn't stop her. If anything, he seemed to encourage it. That night, the boundaries I thought had been rebuilt were completely destroyed. Lila became part of the abuse. Her presence made it feel even more surreal. She would smile and whisper reassurances I didn't want to hear, her touch as unwelcome as his. I felt like I was drowning all over again. The betrayal was worse this time, because it wasn't just him. It was her too. And the most horrifying part was that he didn't see anything wrong with it. "It's just us," he said afterward, wiping a tear from my cheek. "No one else understands. We're family. We take care of each other." One night, I couldn't take it anymore. My voice shook with anger and desperation as I confronted him. "I don't want to do this anymore," I blurted, the words tumbling out before I could lose my nerve. "And I don't want her here. She's making it worse." For a moment, he looked stunned, then hurt, as if I'd accused him of some great injustice. "You're jealous," he said softly. "You don't want to share me." "I'm not jealous," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I just want it to stop." To my surprise, he listened. A week later, Lila was gone. "I ended it," he told me, his tone gentle, almost proud. "I couldn't stand the thought of making you unhappy." His words were a twisted validation, proof that I still had some control over my life, even as everything else felt like it was falling apart. But the relief was short-lived. Without Lila, His focus shifted back to me completely. His touches became more frequent, his excuses more convoluted. "We're closer than most families," he said one night, his hand brushing against my back. "People wouldn't understand, but that's okay. We don't need anyone else." I wanted to scream, to tell him how wrong he was, to shout that I wasn't a replacement for my mom. But the words stayed trapped in my throat, weighed down by fear and guilt. I felt like a bird in a cage with no door, just walls that pressed closer every time I tried to make sense of it. The disgust and confusion never left me, but they became background noise, blending into my routine. I stopped questioning it, because asking questions meant confronting the full weight of what was happening, and I didn't know if I could survive that. University was supposed to be my fresh start, a chance to leave behind everything that had happened and rediscover myself. I fought hard to stay close to home, my dad insisted, but even the short distance felt like freedom. The campus buzzed with life, filled with new faces, endless possibilities, and the hope of a life that wasn't defined by the walls of my house. I threw myself into my studies, losing myself in textbooks and lectures. The structure helped. It gave me something to focus on besides the chaos I had left behind. But even in crowded lecture halls and noisy study groups, my secret followed me. I found myself flinching at casual touches, shrinking away from friendly smiles. Trust felt foreign, a concept I wasn't sure I'd ever grasp again. And then I met Samra Gillespie. We were paired for a history project, and she was everything I wasn't. Confident, funny, and effortlessly kind. It almost hurt to be around her. I'd noticed her before, laughing with friends in the cafeteria, or answering questions in class with an ease that made it seem like nothing in the world could touch her. She had this effortless ability to brighten a room just by being in it. At first, I kept my distance. It felt safer that way. But Sam wouldn't let me. She had a way of drawing people in, of making you feel important with just a glance. "Valerie, right?" she said one day after class, flashing a smile that made my heart skip a beat. "We're in the same group. Want to grab some coffee and brainstorm?" What started as coffee turned into hours of talking. The project was barely mentioned as we swapped stories about our lives. Hers filled with adventures and grand aspirations. Mine carefully edited to omit the things I couldn't bring myself to share. She told me about her family, her love for photography, and her dream of traveling the world. I spoke about my mom, my love of reading, and how university felt like a lifeline I was desperately clinging to. Over the following weeks, we began spending more time together. It wasn't planned, at least not initially. She'd invite me to lunch or ask me to join a study session that would turn into late-night conversations. Being around her felt different, like stepping into sunlight after years of darkness. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly seen, and it terrified me. I wanted to tell her everything, to open up about the parts of my life I'd kept hidden from everyone else. But every time I thought about it, my chest tightened. How could I explain the things I'd done, the things I'd allowed to happen? What if she saw me differently? Or worse, pitied me? So I kept my defenses up, even as they started to crack bit by bit every time she smiled at me. One evening, Sam invited me to her dorm to watch a movie. It was casual, simple, but it felt monumental to me. We sat side by side on her bed with a bowl of popcorn between us, laughing at the ridiculousness of the film. At one point, our hands brushed, and my entire body tensed. She noticed. Of course, she always noticed. But instead of pulling away, she gently placed her hand over mine and said, "You're safe here." Her words hit me like a wave. I wanted so badly to believe her, to fall into the safety she was offering, but the fear was too overwhelming. I excused myself to the bathroom, staring at my reflection as tears streamed down my face. I wanted to be normal, to be someone who could take her hand without feeling crushed by the weight of the world. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two lives. The part of me that longed for connection and wanted to be with Sam couldn't coexist with the part of me still bound by my father's control. Something had to give. That evening, I sat down with my dad for the first real conversation we'd had in months. My hands were trembling, my throat dry, but I forced the words out. "Dad, it has to stop. We can't do this anymore." His face twisted into an expression of shock and something resembling betrayal. "Valerie," he began, his voice low and almost pleading. "You don't mean that. We're all we have, you know that." "I do mean it," I said, my voice gaining strength with every word. "This isn't normal. It's not okay. I can't live like this anymore." For a moment he looked as though he might argue, but then he nodded, his expression unreadable. "If that's what you want," he said quietly, "I'll stop." I wanted to believe him, But a part of me knew better. His promises were fragile, easily broken. Still, it was enough to give me a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to be free. Days turned into weeks, and although my dad had promised to stop, his presence loomed over every aspect of my life like a shadow. Every time he looked at me, spoke to me, or passed by my room, that familiar knot tightened in my stomach. I wanted so badly to trust him, but it felt impossible. His promises had been broken before. Why should this time be any different? Meanwhile, Sam remained my anchor. She had this unique ability to make me feel like I could breathe again, even on my hardest days. One evening, as we sat on the grass outside her dorm watching the sunset, she asked a question that made my heart stop. "Do you ever feel like you're carrying something too heavy to hold on to alone?" she said, her voice soft but piercing. I hesitated, my hands gripping the blades of grass beneath me. I wanted to tell her everything. The words hovered on the tip of my tongue, but every time I tried to say them, fear choked me. What if she looked at me differently? What if she hated me? Worse, what if she reported it and my dad ended up in jail? Despite everything, I couldn't bear that thought. "Sometimes," I finally replied, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't push. Instead, she simply nodded and placed her hand over mine, silently letting me know she'd be there whenever I was ready. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying our conversation in my head. I wanted to believe that Sam would understand, but how could I explain something so twisted, something so far removed from anything she could imagine? And then, one night, everything fell apart. It was late, well past midnight, when I woke to the sound of my door creaking open. My heart sank as I saw my dad standing there, his silhouette framed by the faint light from the hallway. "I just need to talk," he said, his voice strained. But as he stepped closer, I saw the look in his eyes, and I knew it wasn't true. He wasn't there to talk. "No," I said, my voice steadier than I thought it could be. "You promised." But he didn't stop. His movements were rougher this time, more desperate, as if he knew this might be his final opportunity. I fought back, pushing against him with every ounce of strength I could muster, but it only seemed to enrage him further. When it was over, I lay there shaking, tears streaming down my cheeks. Something deep inside me shattered that night, the small, fragile part of me that still held on to hope that things might somehow change. As soon as he left the room, I made up my mind. I couldn't stay, not one more night. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the window, I began packing. My hands trembled as I stuffed clothes into a bag, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Every noise, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, felt deafening, as though the house itself was warning him of my intentions. I knew he'd be heading out soon for his usual Sunday morning grocery trip. The moment I heard the door close behind him, I ran. The walk to the train station felt endless. With every step, I glanced over my shoulder, half convinced I'd see him following me. When I finally boarded the train, I collapsed into a seat, tears streaming down my face. I cried the entire ride, unable to stop until I arrived at Sam's dorm. When she opened the door, her expression shifted immediately from surprise to concern. "What happened?" she asked, pulling me inside. I couldn't get the words out. I just fell into her arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She held me tightly, whispering soothing words I could barely make out over the sound of my own crying. For the first time in years, I felt safe. To anyone watching this who feels trapped, who thinks there's no escape, please know, it's not your fault. What happened to me wasn't my fault, and if it's happening to you, it's not your fault either. There are people who care about you, who want to help, who will believe you. I'm still learning how to heal, but the first step was leaving. The second step is sharing my story. Maybe it's too late to save the person I used to be, but it's not too late to help someone else. If you're watching this and you're scared, confused, or ashamed, please remember, you're not alone. There's a way out, and you deserve to find it. I'm finally beginning to take steps toward healing, and you can too.